heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy.
There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy.
Hello, welcome back to Louis Sinclair Investigates the Dodleston Mysteries. In the previous episode, we looked at the messages and started to realise that almost certainly 2109 was interfering with how they were written, in order possibly to attract attention for some reason. Now we'll focus on the next few questions we asked, questions whose answers will move us closer to completing the jigsaw and seeing that full picture. So was it just a hoax concocted by Ken, Debbie and Peter to fool us? Or indeed a hoax played on them by paranormal entities just having a laugh? How credible is the existence of the folk from the past and their involvement in this mystery? And exactly who or what was 2109? And what was that cryptic clue we appear to have cracked that reveals the true meaning of the Dodleston mysteries? So hoax first, and then an in-depth look at 2109. Let's begin by asking, is the whole thing, as 2109 teased, nothing more than a cheap hoax? Let's start with the potential hoaxers in Dodleston, so Ken, Debbie, Peter, or any of their friends, acquaintances and neighbours. Is the account entirely fiction? A rather clever novel, in effect, where none of this, the messages, the poltergeist activity, the involvement of SPR and so on, simply didn't happen, as suggested by many researchers. Personally, I think it's unlikely. For example, no novelist would ever use the same name for multiple characters. It's far too confusing. And in Ken Webster's account, I've counted 4 Johns, 3 Davids, and 3 Thomases, though to avoid confusion I didn't use each name when it wasn't important to the story. Next, only Peter, who would have studied Chaucer's Canterbury Tales at Oxford, could have faked these messages in so-called Middle English. But he was rarely at Meadow Cottage, and sometimes Ken was alone there, sometimes just Debbie. But the messages still came through. And anyway, Peter, if he was involved in a hoax, wouldn't have risked the credibility of the account by writing such poor quality medieval English when he was perfectly capable of composing it correctly. Another indication that it's not fiction was Lucas's warning that computers should be kept away from governments in case they use it against their people, presumably for surveillance and the like. Now, in the mid-80s, when most computers were little more than typewriters with a few fun but clunky games, that's a huge leap of imagination from Ken and the others, who had no real interest in computing as such. And I'm sure that we can discount the neighbours' involvement. Miss C, as she was known, had been a rather famous singer in her early years, but now was frail and largely housebound. So, despite SPR's suspicions, it's rather unlikely she'd be so keen on hoaxing people that she'd clamber up some stepladders, struggle through a trap door into the shared loft space, and then crawl through the sour-tasting dust, the bird poo and the cobwebs, and start typing. But could it have been someone else breaking into Meadow Cottage? No, almost impossible. From 1984 to 1986, over 100 messages were left on the borrowed BBC micros. No intruder would ever risk breaking in that many times, either directly into Meadow Cottage or through the loft space from next door. And it's historically true that the original cottage, Lucas's cottage, was burnt to the ground in the 1540s because of the villagers' concerns about the devilish activities there. And now some concrete proof. That interview with SPR in the Chester Observer newspaper. I've checked. It exists in their archive. So the involvement of SPR is definitely not fiction. And finally, something very down to earth. In the 1980s, the United Kingdom had the highest interest rates, the highest inflation, and the highest unemployment figures pretty well since records began. So if you had a good, secure job in those days, would you have risked it just for a joke? Ken and Peter were teachers in a highly respected school, Harden High School. Supposing you were the head teacher there, how would you react if a couple of your staff published a book that might attract widespread mockery, potentially harming the reputation of your school and its staff? Without doubt, Ken and Peter would have been putting their careers and their financial security on the line. And that includes the named librarian at Brasenose College, Robin Peedle, who, whilst at work, had done intensive research for them and thus had given credibility to their story. There's no way he'd have risked his distinguished Oxford University career putting his name to what might turn out to be a ludicrous hoax. And revealingly, he's never asked for his name to be removed, even from the new second edition of The Vertical Plane. So no, I think we can confidently dismiss the view that the story is just fiction. The other 1980s hoax possibility is that it was the work of a hacker, years before the internet was available to the public. SPR suggested that data might have been sent down the computer's earthwire. Although, following a significant modification that might be technically possible, Ken actually borrowed several BBC micros from the school at random. So, no. So if this isn't a hoax perpetrated by humans, we have to seriously consider the possibility that we're dealing with the paranormal, either indulging in a mischievous hoax from beyond, or something more sophisticated, possibly something to do with 2109's experiment. So, is this a hoax run by paranormal entities, either 2109 or, as we'll look at first, poltergeists? Poltergeists are thought to feed on anxiety, fear and distress, and certainly Meadow Cottage had become fraught with negative energy. Ken and Debbie were frequently stressed out and arguing, and this would have been an attractive and sumptuous meal to anxiety-hungry poltergeists. I asked Steve Meara, renowned researcher into the paranormal and editor of Phenomena magazine with nearly 2 million subscribers, for his thoughts, particularly on why the story starts with simple poltergeist activity, stacking objects in the kitchen, for example.
Well, in terms of otherworldly entities, poltergeists are the most resourceful of all paranormal phenomena. Many believe they exist in the lost zone of the shadow spirit world, from which, like bad apples in water, they rise to the surface of our earthly existence, attract the unwary, and then feed upon the resulting negative energy. So, by moving those items, the phenomena enticed Ken, Debbie and Peter to become interested, engaged, and, as a result, an unhealthy connection was made.
I think this is really important. In other words, if a person is interested or indeed involved in paranormal matters, then they're susceptible to being lured into the poltergeist world. They've already got, as it were, one foot in the door, a door that poltergeists would be more than happy to open wide, and in this story, not just poltergeists, but 2109 too, on the lookout for suitable guinea pigs for its experiment. We know for certain that Debbie already had an interest in the paranormal and was fascinated by the early goings-on, as was Ken, who from the very beginning firmly believed in Lucas's existence. So yes, both of them would have been very likely candidates for unworldly attention. But what about Lucas? Was he also interested in the paranormal, and thus potentially attracting and opening the door to unworldly entities, including 2109. In medieval times, Oxford and the surrounds were famous, well, infamous really, for practitioners of alchemy that, amongst other beliefs, thought that the spirit of an enlightened person can affect reality, and Lucas uses many words that indicate an alchemical knowledge. For example, in one message he refers to quintessence, otherwise known as ether, the mystical material that, it was thought, filled the universe beyond the earth, and something of great interest to alchemists. So it looks as if Lucas too, with his evident interest in alchemy, had one foot in the door, and open to paranormal experiences, a suitable person of interest, and why he'd attracted 2109's attention in the first place. It's highly likely, therefore, that it isn't an accident that Ken, Debbie and Lucas found themselves involved, but they were actually chosen deliberately, thus answering the puzzling question, why were these specific people involved? I then asked Steve Mera if poltergeists or other unworldly entities would be capable of creating the text on the beeb.
Oh, without doubt. Such a phenomenon can occur. Electrical and electronic devices can be utilised as a form of communication. They once were referred to as ghosts in the machine.
So it seems that a paranormal hoax is a possibility. Nothing more than a joke played on Ken, Debbie and Peter. It ticks all the right boxes, except one. As Steve told me, all the paranormal hoaxes he studied, dozens and dozens of them, have one thing in common. They're brief. They're simple. The entities find a victim, go in, stir up trouble, have a laugh, and then move on swiftly to their next target. But the Dodleston mysteries aren't just a brief involvement. They went on for nearly 2 years, and I'm sure you'll agree that the story's a million miles from being simple. So no, a paranormal hoax, just for a laugh and a cheap thrill, seems very unlikely. So in conclusion, it looks as if we're not dealing with a hoax from anyone, not from Ken and his friends, nor from the paranormal world. So if that's the case, what are we dealing with? And to answer that, let's take a closer look at the characters from the past and those from possibly the future. First, from the past. Lucas, real name Thomas Harden, his clergyman friend and the sheriff. Is their 16th century existence credible? And what's their involvement? Now, there's a bit of uncertainty about their exact date. You may recall that Lucas, very early on, had said that King Henry VIII was 46 years old. So that would have made it 1537. However, later, Lucas said that the date was actually 1546, backed up by referring to the Queen as Catherine Parr, who didn't marry Henry until 1543. Perhaps the earlier date is another instance of 2109 messing around with the messages. And contrary to some researchers' opinion, the inconsistency doesn't prove that Ken is hoaxing us. Surely he wouldn't make such a crass error in his very detailed and carefully researched account. Either way, it doesn't really matter, because either date is credible for this rather obscure reason. That final line, de te eradicant, is actually a direct quotation from the comedy Andrea, written by the Latin playwright Terence in 166 BC.
Take it from me directly, and let the child down before our door. Take some sacred herbs from the altar here and strew them under it. Make haste then.
May the gods confound you. You do so terrify poor me.
The play was first translated into English in 1520, and it was very commonly used by clerics at that time to practice their Latin. So it's highly likely that Lucas's clergyman friend, studying with him at Oxford, would have been familiar with a play that after Tudor times fell into obscurity, and he'd quoted it from memory in that chalk message on the kitchen floor. And if we're tempted to suspect Peter's hand in writing the Latin, though he would have studied Latin at school, Terence's play was never on any high school syllabus, simply because it's too advanced. So no, it's not Peter's handiwork. But in truth, these characters from the past are largely passive ones, more likely to have been victims than perpetrators, and they certainly wouldn't have had the technology to move or communicate through time. So really we're left with the entities possibly from the future, as suggested in effect by Lucas, when he said that his computer
comes not from my nor your time.
You may recall that Lucas wondered if there were an unworldly entity involved. So let's turn our attention in that direction to 2109 and 1. I think it's with these that we'll get our clearest answers about the reality of what was going on. First, 1, that arrogant green man who appeared quite late in the story. At first he seemed helpful, but eventually all the characters, admittedly encouraged by 2109, felt that 1 had shown his true colours when he'd bragged about being able to control humans, and so they'd shunned him. And in the end, as we know, 1 disappeared after 2109 had contacted him, pushed him out of the time conflation, and dismissed him as being completely irrelevant. From the experiment's point of view, just another aberration, like the poltergeists. Well, at least that's how things seem. But, as we'll see in the next and final episode about the meaning of the Dodleston mysteries, there may be more to 1 than meets the eye. And finally, who or what is 2109? Early in the story, 2109 had said,
"We are many, but no more than one in the time to come."
So, as we've already figured out, 2109 appears to be more than one entity, either representing a group of them, or, more likely from the clues, 2109 is a collective of entities. Star Trek's Borg, in effect, though thankfully with slightly better manners. And that message continued, describing the collective as
Movement that casts no shadows, thought without chemical reaction.
so seemingly an entity without physical substance. 2109 is obviously in control of the whole situation, since it was 2109
Who did bring the box of lights?
the computer to Lucas. 2109 appears not only to be in charge, but also capable of controlling the situation, including the actions of the protagonists. So, moving the floppy disk from the windowsill to encourage them to continue messaging each other, in other words, to continue with the experiment. Conveying a very frightened Lucas to see Debbie. Actually controlling Lucas, perhaps, which is possibly why he was not quite what he seems to be, rather like his messages, as we saw in the previous episode. And talking of the messages, writing in chalk in Meadow Cottage's kitchen, including writing out that threat in Latin from Lucas's friend, altering or faking Lucas's messages on the beeb, and very significantly controlling how all the medieval messages were expressed, the language that was used. Actually, it's just struck me that we have concrete evidence of that. Occasionally 2109 would write in Middle English to Lucas, and those messages were identical in style to Lucas's, with the same mix of sophistication and rubbish, showing clearly that there's a single intelligence behind all the messages, and a giveaway that it was 2109. And finally, as regards 2109, you remember at the beginning of the story those footprints on the walls with 6 toes? And that later 2109 had said,
As long as your kind cannot penetrate our world, we are safe.
penetrate our world? So is the collective closer than we think? Just below our feet, perhaps? I'm sure you've heard of the hollow earth theory, which proposes that there's a subterranean world below the surface of our planet, a belief that goes back at least as far as the ancient Greeks. And, according to some researchers, the entities there are descended from the 6-toed humans of the Golden Age, who have enlightened understanding and travel using portals. Portals assisting Lucas's visits, perhaps. Yes, highly speculative, I agree. But why else would the 6-toed footprints have been mentioned at the very beginning of the book? Anyway, in conclusion, 2109, an entity, either an enhanced humanoid from the future, seemingly without a body, an artificial intelligence entity perhaps, or a paranormal entity beyond material existence, or even an extraterrestrial. Any of these capable of not only connecting times through tachyonic technology perhaps, but also of affecting the people there, mentally through a powerful form of telepathy, and perhaps physically by projecting them through metaphysical portals, with the bonus of collecting first-hand observations about its experiment by getting Lucas in the past and Ken in the present to write up lab notes for the collective in those all-important books, in effect written up by the guinea pigs themselves, the specimens who'd actually experienced the experiment, rather like asking bacteria in a petri dish to write down how they feel after they've been dosed with a prototype antibiotic. Valuable feedback for experimenters. But before we finish, we should consider one other thought. 2109 seemed very knowledgeable about UFOs and how, as it said, when in an earthly area of convectional magnetism, their passengers could be projected through time and space onto or into an existing human, a kind of literal transubstantiation. Was it a hint that 2109 and 1 were actually extraterrestrials? But, extraterrestrial or not, 2109 seemed very curious about humanity, its behaviour, its strengths and weaknesses, its perceptiveness, and interested in testing humanity's ability to read between the lines, in effect the literal meaning of the word intelligence. Intelligence. Is this why 2109 was testing the 1980s folk with its manipulated messages? Figuring out how intelligent they were? Were they bright enough to spot the inconsistencies, the clues? Or is it our intelligence that the collective is really testing when we read that all-important book? But why might it be testing us? And this is the main question we'll be asking and answering with the help of that 2109 cipher, in The Meaning, the final part of the Dodleston Mysteries, the full story. Until then, many thanks for watching. See you after the break. Cheerio.
There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy.